300 feet below this ridgeline, a river so wild that Congress stepped in to protect its slides quietly toward the Mississippi. The bluffs we are about to hike were nearly carved into house lots in the 1960s, and it took a group of determined citizens racing the bulldozers to save them. What they saved is Afton State Park, 1,600 acres of ravines, restored prairie, and Oak Savanna hanging above the St. Croix River in Minnesota. On this September afternoon, we are going to walk almost 10 miles of it, from the water line to the highest grassy ridgetops. Along the way, there is a flour mill built without nails, a Scottish poem that named a town, and a landscape left behind by a melting glacier. Lace up, because the first ravine is waiting. Afton State Park sits in Washington County, on the far eastern edge of Minnesota, about 20 miles from downtown St. Paul. The park runs along the west bank of the St. Croix River, which forms the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin here. Just north of the park lies the small river village of Afton, the town that gives the park its name. Everything in this landscape is organized by the river valley, with high rolling farm country on top and a deep wooded trench along the water. The trails we are hiking today drop from the bluff tops down long ravines to the shoreline, then climb right back up again. It is one of the closest truly rugged hikes to the Twin Cities. The hike begins up top, in open grassland that rolls away in every direction. In late September, the prairie is at its tallest, with grasses running head-high in places and the last wildflowers of the season still holding color. Restored prairies like this one bloom from June into September, with big bluestem, Indian grass, blazing star, and purple coneflower taking turns through the summer. What looks timeless here is actually a comeback story, because most of this ground spent a century as farm fields. The park has been patiently turning those old fields back into prairie for decades. For now, we just follow the mowed path through the grass toward the lip of the valley. To understand why this flat farm country suddenly plunges into ravines, you have to go back to the Ice Age. The land that became Afton State Park was shaped in the wake of a giant glacier, which buried this region and then melted away. The retreating ice left behind rolling hills of rock and gravel debris called moraine, which is the lumpy high ground we started on. Torrents of glacial meltwater then tore through the region, helping carve the deep valley of the St. Croix. The plunging ravines that cut through the park are part of that legacy, worn down through the soft ground toward the river. Every step downhill from here is a walk through that story. The trail tips over the edge and drops into the first ravine, and the temperature falls with it. Up top it was all sun and grass, but down here it is shade, ferns, and hardwood forest closing overhead. These ravine trails are the signature of Afton, deep folds in the land that wind down toward the river. The footing gets steeper, and the walls rise on both sides as we descend. It is easy to forget that open farmland sits just a few hundred feet above our heads. This is the terrain that convinced people this place deserved to be a park. Look at the walls of these ravines and you can see the bones of the landscape. The soil on the surface here is thin, and beneath it lie thick layers of bedrock, including sandstone laid down as sediment in ancient seas. In some of the ravines, erosion has stripped the cover away and exposed that sandstone in outcrops along the stream cuts. Water is still working on this valley today, the same way glacial meltwater did thousands of years ago. Each rainstorm carries a little more of the bluff down toward the river. The ravines we are hiking are not finished landforms, they are works in progress. The ravine finally opens up and delivers us to the bottom of the valley. Through the trees, flashes of silver appear, and then the full width of the St. Croix spreads out ahead. Down here the trail flattens and runs along the base of the bluffs. After the shaded descent, the river light feels enormous. Sailboats and fishing boats work the channel on a warm Saturday like this one. It is a good moment to talk about what this river actually is. The stretch of river beside the park is broad and slow, and it even has its own name, Lake St. Croix. Along its lower miles, the St. Croix widens into a long lake-like reach that continues south until the river meets the Mississippi at Prescott. On the far shore rise the bluffs of Wisconsin, so the water here is a border as well as a highway. In the steamboat era, this wide water carried lumber, wheat, and passengers between the river towns. Villages like Afton grew up on its banks precisely because the river was the road. Today the traffic is sailboats, but the geography has not changed. The shoreline trail is the gentlest walking of the day, cruising along between the water and the wooded bluff. Somewhere along here is a detail that turns out to matter enormously in this park's history, a natural sand beach. When this land came up for sale in the 1960s, it held the last undeveloped natural beach on the Minnesota side of the lower river. People swim here in summer, picnic on the grass, and launch canoes into the current. It looks ordinary, and that is exactly the point. Without a fight to save it, this shore would look very different today. Long before there was a park, or even a town called Afton, this neighborhood had a much less poetic name, Catfish Bar. The name came from a large sandbar in the St. Croix, still visible when the water runs low. In the days before bridges or even ferry boats, the bar was a place where the river was shallow enough to ford with horses and cattle. That made this bend in the river a natural crossing point, and crossings attract settlers. The first arrivals came to this area in 1837. A shallow spot in a river, it turns out, can be the seed of an entire community. The trail threads through floodplain forest now, under big cottonwoods that love having their feet near the water. It is worth remembering that people have been walking this shore for a very long time, long before any state park signs went up. The Dakota lived in and traveled through the St. Croix Valley when the first American settlers arrived. Then came farmers, millers, and ferry operators, all drawn by the same river we are walking beside. Every trail in this park crosses ground that was once somebody's field, wood lot, or landing. The next few stops tell their story. The village of Afton, just north of the park, holds some genuine Minnesota firsts. The first farmers in this area, Joseph Haskell and James Norris, arrived in 1839, and Haskell raised his first crops of corn and wheat the following year. That planting made him one of the very first American farmers in what would become the state of Minnesota. Think about what that means. The transformation of this valley from Oak Savanna and prairie into farmland began right here. The fields they broke stayed in production for more than a century, and as we will see, the park is now carefully undoing parts of that transformation. The route bends away from the shore and starts to climb, and the legs feel it immediately. Afton does not believe in gentle grades. The trails here take the ravines head-on. Oak and maple close over the path as we gain height, with glimpses of the river falling away behind. Hikers coming the other way are breathing just as hard, which is some comfort. Somewhere off to the north, a small creek runs down to the river, and on that creek stood one of the most remarkable buildings in early Minnesota. It was a mill built by a man with almost nothing but patience. Around 1843, a settler named Lemuel Bowles built the first commercial flour mill in Minnesota on the creek that now carries his name, just outside the present park. The story of its construction is astonishing. Bowles salvaged wood from the shore of Lake St. Croix and carried it on his back to the mill site more than a mile upstream. Lacking nails, he fastened the small mill together with wooden pegs. First built to grind corn and wheat, the mill was remodeled over the years and stayed in operation until his death in 1875. Later mills followed on the same creek, including the North Star Flour Mill in 1860, and for a while this quiet valley was a milling neighborhood. Back on high ground, the trail rolls along a ridge with the valley opening and closing through the trees. This is classic Afton rhythm: climb hard, cruise the ridge, then drop into the next fold of land. The September woods are just starting to turn, with a few maples showing orange at the edges. Below us, the village of Afton sits on its narrow shelf between the bluffs and the water. It is a tiny place with an outsized amount of history. Even its name has a story worth telling, and it starts in Scotland. In 1791, the Scottish poet Robert Burns wrote a gentle love song to a small river in Ayrshire called the Afton Water. The poem, Sweet Afton, begins with the line, "Flow gently, sweet Afton, among thy green braes." Half a world away and decades later, settlers on the St. Croix thought this quiet stretch of river deserved the same mood. When the village was platted in 1855, they reached for the poem and named the town Afton. It is one of the more romantic town namings in Minnesota, a frontier settlement borrowing its identity from Scottish verse. The old name, Catfish Bar, quietly retired. Now comes the serious climbing, the long grind from river level back to the bluff tops. The park's trails and stairways gain hundreds of feet here, and there is no way around it, only up. This is also the climb that backpackers make with full packs, because Afton does camping differently. There is no drive and campground here. The sites are backpack-in only, reached by hiking up this very hill. The park maintains more than 24 backpack campsites on the high ground, most of them around a mile from the trailhead. Earning your campsite with your legs keeps the nights up there remarkably quiet. Before highway bridges spanned the St. Croix, getting across this river meant a boat, and for generations that meant a ferry. At South Afton, a ferry run by J.P. Ferber carried people, wagons, and animals across Lake St. Croix to the Wisconsin side. River ferries like his were lifelines, connecting Minnesota farms to Wisconsin towns and markets. The crossings were slow, weather-dependent, and utterly essential. Eventually, bridges upstream and downstream made the ferries obsolete, and the crossings faded into memory. Stand on the shore today, and it takes imagination to picture the wagons lining up at the landing. And then the trees open, and the whole valley is suddenly below us. From the blufftop overlooks, the St. Croix stretches north and south in a broad silver sheet, with Wisconsin rising green on the far side. The vertical drop from this rim to the water is about 300 feet. Sailboats look like toys down there, and the wind arrives with nothing to slow it down. This is the view that made people fall in love with this land, and the view that nearly got it developed. Take a long look, because everything about this park exists so that this moment stays possible. The valley below is really a stack of landscapes, and you can read them like steps. Along the river sit level benches called terraces, old floors of the valley left high and dry as the water cut deeper over thousands of years. On those terraces and on the driest south-facing bluffs, native bluff prairies once thrived, grasslands clinging to the steep, sunny ground. Above them rise the wooded ravine walls, and above everything, the rolling moraine we started on. The vertical drop of 300 feet packs several distinct natural worlds into one hillside. Very few places near the Twin Cities let you hike through all of them in a single afternoon. Up on the ridgetops, the trail runs through open grassland again, and the walking feels like sailing. Tall grasses hiss against boots, and grasshoppers scatter ahead of every step. In September, the prairie has gone golden, with seed heads heavy and the last blazing star holding purple down in the swales. It is worth pausing to appreciate how rare this scene is, because most of Minnesota's prairie vanished under the plow generations ago. What surrounds us here is partly original and partly rebuilt, acre by acre. That rebuilding is one of the quiet heroics of this park. Scattered across the park's uplands stand big open-grown oaks with grass beneath them, a landscape called Oak Savanna. Savanna is a in-between world, not quite forest and not quite prairie, and it once covered vast areas of southern Minnesota. It is now among the rarest habitats in the Midwest because it disappeared so easily into farms and overgrown woods. At Afton, crews are restoring former fields to prairie and savanna and clearing invasive plants like buckthorn that crowd out the natives. The park's rolling glacial hills, with their thin soils and sunny slopes, are exactly the ground where savanna belongs. Those gnarled open oaks are the old survivors, and the restoration is slowly giving them room again. The trail weaves between grassland and oak shade now, through the very landscape we just described. Some of these bur oaks are old enough to remember the farm era, standing alone in what were once pastures and fields. Their thick corky bark is a fire adaptation, built to shrug off the flames that once swept through regularly. Wild turkeys work the ground under the oaks, and deer bed down in the tall grass at the edges. It is a landscape that looks casual and park-like, but it is actually a precise ecosystem, and keeping it alive requires something surprising, which is fire. For thousands of years, fire was a regular visitor to these prairies and savannas, sparked by lightning and set intentionally by indigenous people. Grasses and prairie flowers evolved to thrive on it, resprouting from deep roots, while fire kept brush and invading trees from taking over. When settlement stopped the fires, the savannas began to choke and disappear. So today, park crews bring fire back on purpose, running carefully planned prescribed burns at Afton to maintain the prairie and savanna. A burned hillside looks stark for a few weeks, then comes back greener and thicker than before. It is one of conservation's great counterintuitive lessons that this landscape needs flames to survive. These upland miles go quickly, rolling through meadow after meadow with the valley appearing and disappearing on our left. The park packs roughly 20 miles of trail into its 1,600 acres, so routes like this one can stretch most of a day. Bluebird boxes dot the fence lines, and hawks hang over the grass looking for movement. It feels permanent, like it was always going to be a park. It was not. The story of how close this place came to being a subdivision deserves the next few minutes. In 1967, a large undeveloped property on this shore came on the market, including that last natural beach on the Minnesota side of the lower river. Conservation-minded citizens understood immediately what was at stake, because riverfront like this was being bought and built on fast. They organized, raised money, and started buying land and negotiating options themselves, ahead of any government action. By the time a bill to create Afton State Park reached the Minnesota legislature in 1969, they had secured options on 827 acres valued at $876,000. The legislature authorized the park that year. Private citizens had essentially held the door open until the state could walk through it. Walking these quiet trails, you would never guess how contested this ground once was. The 1969 authorization was the beginning of the story, not the end. Land had to be assembled parcel by parcel, plans had to be drawn and redrawn, and neighbors had to be persuaded. Every overlook and campsite we pass today sits on ground that someone once had other plans for. Parks look inevitable only in hindsight. In real time, they are fights. Not everyone wanted a park here, and many local residents opposed it, fearing crowds of visitors descending on their quiet township. The resistance continued after authorization, and acquiring the rest of the land dragged on for 13 years. Compromises reshaped the park along the way. The entrance was moved from the north side to the west, the road was shortened, and snowmobiles were banned entirely. Afton State Park finally opened to the public in 1982, with the visitor center completed the following year. The result of all that friction is, ironically, one of the most peaceful parks in the state. The compromises made it quieter, wilder, and more foot-powered than it might have been. The afternoon light is turning gold now, sliding sideways through the oaks as we loop back toward the valley rim. September might be the perfect month here, warm enough for the beach, cool enough for the climbs, with fall color just beginning. The summer crowds have thinned, and long stretches of trail belong to nobody but us. Below, the river keeps up its slow, patient work on the valley. There is one more piece of the protection story, and it belongs to the river itself. Because the water down there has a federal title. The St. Croix was one of the original 8 rivers protected under the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. In October 1972, President Richard Nixon signed legislation adding 27 more miles of the lower river to the system, the first addition since the act was created. The remaining miles down to the Mississippi, the stretch that flows past this park, were added under state administration shortly after. Together they form the Lower St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, jointly cared for by the National Park Service, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. That is why the shoreline below us looks green instead of walled with development. Park on the bluffs, protected river below, the two designations guard this valley together. All that protected habitat adds up to an extraordinary amount of life. Birdwatchers have recorded well over 200 species in and around this park, and the river corridor is a natural migration flyway. Bald eagles patrol the valley, hawks ride the bluff updrafts, and eastern bluebirds nest along the prairie edges. Spring and fall bring waves of warblers and waterfowl moving through the floodplain forests. On the ground, white-tailed deer, red fox, coyotes, and wild turkeys share the ravines and grasslands. Every habitat we hike today, beach, floodplain, ravine forest, savanna, and prairie, holds its own cast of residents. The trail eases at last, delivering us back across the prairie with almost 10 miles behind us. Afton State Park is what happens when geology, history, and stubborn citizens all leave their mark on the same square miles. A glacier built it, farmers and millers worked it, a poet accidentally named it, and neighbors fought over it until it became something everyone could share. The bluffs still stand 300 feet over the St. Croix, the savanna oaks are getting their fire back, and the beach that started it all is still just sand and river. If your legs want a real climb within sight of the Twin Cities, this is the place. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.